He brought the injured Apache woman home, then learned it was an old Apache marriage rite. It was late in the afternoon when Tom McAllister, a rancher living on the edge of the Arizona plains, finished his work for the day. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the dry, dusty land. Tom had spent the day tending to his cattle, repairing a broken fence and making sure the water troughs were full. Life on the ranch was not easy, but Tom had grown used to the rhythm of it. Every day brought its own challenges, and every night was a chance to rest before starting all over again. He liked the quiet, the way the wind whispered across the open fields, and the peaceful sense of being alone with nature. That peace, however, was about to change. Tom had just finished his evening chores and was heading toward his small cabin when he noticed movement near the edge of the property. At first he thought it was one of his horses wandering too close to the fence, but as he got closer, he realized it was something else entirely. A young man, dressed in worn and dusty clothes, was staggering across the land. He looked exhausted, and his face was pale from sun and fatigue. The man's eyes were alert but wary, scanning the open plain, as if he feared something or someone was following him. Tom's first instinct was caution. He had heard stories about strangers arriving unannounced, and in a place like this, strangers were often trouble. But as he got closer, he could see that the man was not armed or threatening. He appeared weak, almost collapsing under the weight of his own exhaustion. Tom could not turn away. His father had taught him to help those in need, and Tom could not ignore a human being who clearly needed help. He called out gently, "Hey there! You all right?" The man stopped, his eyes meeting Tom's. There was a moment of hesitation, a silent calculation before he nodded slightly. Tom stepped closer, keeping his hands visible, and offered, "You look like you could use some water. Come on, I won't hurt you." The stranger seemed to weigh his options. Finally, he took a careful step forward. His clothes were torn in places, and his shoes were worn thin. Tom noticed faint cuts on his hands and arms, likely from travel through rough terrain. "I'm not going to hurt you," Tom said again, softly. "You can rest at my place, just for tonight." The young man's face softened slightly, though he did not speak. He nodded again and allowed Tom to guide him back toward the cabin. Along the way, Tom noticed the way the man moved, careful, alert, almost like a predator hiding in plain sight. There was something unusual about him, something that suggested he had survived difficult situations before. Tom did not know the man's story yet, but he could tell that this was no ordinary traveler. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun had nearly disappeared below the horizon. Tom opened the door and motioned for the man to enter. The interior was small but clean, with a wooden table, a few chairs, and a fireplace that had been prepared for the evening. Tom offered the stranger a seat and went to fill a cup with water. When he handed it over, the man took it carefully, his hands trembling slightly, and drank slowly, as if afraid the water might disappear if he drank too quickly. Tom watched him quietly, trying not to overwhelm him with questions.
"You've had a long day," he said finally.
"Where are you from?" The man shook his head, then gave a faint shrug. He spoke a few words, but they were not in English. Tom could not understand him, but he did not press the matter. Words were not always necessary. Sometimes, actions spoke louder. He went into the kitchen area and began preparing a simple meal, some bread, dried meat, and coffee. The smell of food seemed to relax the young man slightly, and he watched Tom's movements with curiosity.
After the meal, Tom offered him a place to sleep.
His own bed was small but comfortable, and the floor could easily accommodate a blanket. "You can take my bed," Tom said, gesturing to the neatly made mattress.
"I'll take the floor tonight." The man's eyes widened slightly, a mixture of surprise and suspicion. He hesitated, then nodded slowly, as if accepting the offer but still unsure of what to expect.
Tom unrolled a blanket on the floor, making a simple sleeping area for himself. He could see the tension in the young man's body, the way he sat stiffly, scanning the cabin as though preparing for some unseen danger. Tom wondered what kind of life this stranger had led to make him so careful, so wary of a simple act of kindness. Night fell quickly over the desert, and the cabin grew dark except for the soft glow of the fire and the hearth. The man sat quietly on the bed, still alert, occasionally glancing toward Tom. It was clear he was not used to being offered help without a catch or a threat. Tom tried to speak gently. "You don't have to be afraid. You're safe here." The man's eyes softened slightly, but then he leaned back on the bed and whispered something in his own language. Tom did not understand, but the tone was not hostile. It was almost a warning, or perhaps a promise. He felt a shiver run down his spine, not from fear, but from the realization that this stranger carried a story, a past filled with experiences that Tom could only imagine. Tom lay down on the floor, trying to rest, but he found himself listening to the sound of the wind outside and the occasional shuffle from the young man on the bed. The air was quiet, except for these small sounds, and Tom realized how unusual it was to feel so connected to someone he had just met. There was a tension, a silent understanding, a sense that the night held more than just darkness. It held possibilities. As the hours passed, Tom's curiosity grew. Who was this young man? Why had he been running? And why had he come to him, a solitary rancher, for help? Tom did not ask these questions out loud, fearing that any sudden inquiry might break the fragile trust forming between them. Instead, he focused on the simple acts of hospitality, making sure the fire stayed warm, keeping his movements calm, and allowing the stranger space to feel safe. Just before dawn, the man spoke again, this time more clearly. "You gave me your bed, rancher. Get ready for what comes next," he said in English, his voice low but firm. Tom sat up, startled. The words were not a threat, but they carried weight, as if the stranger was preparing him for something he could not yet imagine. Tom nodded slowly, unsure what to expect, but trusting that whatever came next, he had made the right choice by helping this young man. The first rays of sunlight crept into the cabin, illuminating the faces of both men. The night's tension had not completely disappeared, but it had changed. Tom realized that he was no longer just a rancher providing shelter. He was part of a story, a chapter in someone else's life that had intersected with his own. He could feel the weight of responsibility, the need to act with care, and the understanding that kindness could bring unexpected consequences, sometimes dangerous, sometimes rewarding, but always meaningful. Tom looked at the young man, now seated on the bed with a calmer expression, and knew that this encounter would mark the beginning of something extraordinary. The desert outside was wide and harsh, full of dangers and mysteries, but inside the small cabin there was a fragile trust that had formed in just one night. Tom did not yet know the full story, and he could not predict what would happen next, but he felt a strange sense of readiness. He had offered help when it was needed most, and now he would face the unknown alongside the stranger he had taken in. As the morning light strengthened, Tom prepared for the day, aware that everything had changed. The wind blew softly through the open window, carrying the scent of sagebrush and earth. The young man watched him quietly, and Tom understood that this was the beginning of a journey neither of them had expected. It was a journey that would test courage, trust, and understanding, and it would forever change the lives of both the rancher and the fugitive he had chosen to help. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of dry earth and sagebrush across Tom McAllister's ranch. Sunlight spilled over the hills, painting the desert in soft golds and oranges. Tom had already risen before dawn, finishing the routine chores he always performed, checking the water troughs, mending a fence, and inspecting the herd of cattle grazing nearby. But this morning felt different. His mind kept returning to the young Apache man who had slept in his bed the night before. He could not shake the memory of the quiet, watchful eyes, or the words spoken just before dawn. "You gave me your bed, rancher." Get ready for what comes next. Tom wondered what exactly the young man had meant. Was it a warning? A promise? He could not tell. Still, Tom knew that he had chosen to help someone in need, and that decision weighed heavily on his mind. It was rare for him to meet strangers, and rarer still for one to arrive at his door without fear or hesitation. Tom had lived on this land for nearly 20 years, and during that time he had grown accustomed to solitude. But the arrival of the Apache fugitive had changed that. Inside the small cabin, the young man had already risen as well. He sat quietly on the edge of the bed, observing Tom as he moved about the room. His movements were deliberate and calm, yet alert, as if he was always prepared for something unexpected. There was a quiet dignity in the way he carried himself, a strength that seemed to radiate even from someone who had traveled through harsh conditions. Tom noticed the faint scars on the man's hands, evidence of past struggles that were hidden beneath the dust and dirt of the journey. Tom decided to speak, though carefully. "Good morning," he said, his voice steady. "Did you sleep all right?" The man nodded, his eyes briefly meeting Tom's before looking away. He did not answer with words, but the nod carried a message. He was safe, for now. Tom sensed that the young man was cautious, not because he feared Tom personally, but because he had learned to trust very few people in his life. That caution was understandable, and Tom respected it. Tom poured a cup of coffee for himself and offered one to the young man. The man hesitated, then accepted it, holding the cup with both hands. As the warm liquid touched his lips, a small sigh of relief escaped him. Tom realized that small comforts, food, water, shelter, meant far more than they ever could to someone who had been running and hiding. "You're welcome to stay here as long as you need," Tom said softly. "I won't ask questions if you don't want to answer them." The man's eyes lingered on Tom for a moment. It was clear he understood the offer, though he remained silent. There was a bond forming, unspoken but significant, built on trust and a shared understanding of survival. Tom knew that words alone could not establish such a connection. It would take actions, patience, and time. After breakfast, Tom suggested that they both attend to the ranch. "We've got fences to repair and water to check. If you're able, you can help me." The sun was climbing higher in the sky, and the heat began to press down on the land. Tom handed the man a hammer and some nails, guiding him through the task of repairing a broken fence post. At first, the young man worked cautiously, watching Tom's movements and mimicking them. But soon he displayed a skill and precision that surprised Tom. He moved with confidence and strength, as though he had performed similar tasks many times before. "You've done this before?" Tom said, impressed. The man simply nodded, not offering details. Tom respected that. It was enough to know that he was capable and willing to help. They worked in silence for a while, the only sounds being the occasional clang of metal and the distant lowing of cattle. Despite the heat, there was a rhythm to their work, a sense of cooperation that felt natural and unforced. As the day went on, Tom noticed other things about his guest. He was observant, scanning the surroundings constantly, noticing details that Tom had overlooked in his own familiarity with the land. The young man pointed out a weak spot in the fence, a patch of dry grass that could easily catch fire, and even a stray calf that had wandered too close to the edge of the property. Tom realized that this fugitive was not only a survivor, but also someone with a sharp mind and a keen sense of awareness. Around midday, Tom led the young man to the water troughs to refill them. The sun was high and hot, and sweat ran down their faces. The man took a moment to rest, crouching near the trough and drinking deeply from the water. Tom watched him, reflecting on how far he must have traveled to reach this point. He imagined the deserts, hills, and rivers the young man had crossed, and the dangers he must have faced along the way. Tom felt a growing respect for him, tempered by a sense of responsibility. He had offered safety, and now he had to ensure that this stranger remained safe under his watch. While they worked, Tom's mind drifted back to the words spoken the night before. "Get ready for what comes next." He had tried to ignore them, attributing them to caution or wariness. But as the day wore on, he began to wonder if the words carried a deeper meaning. Was the young man warning him of danger, or was he preparing him for some test, some challenge that would require both courage and wisdom? Tom did not know, but he resolved to be vigilant. In the afternoon, the pair returned to the cabin for a brief rest. The young man cleaned himself as best he could, washing the dirt and sweat from his hands and face. Tom offered him clean clothes from a spare set he kept for visitors, and the man accepted them without hesitation. There was a simplicity to the exchange, yet it revealed another layer of trust forming between them. Small gestures like these, sharing food, water, and clothing, were building a bond stronger than words. As they rested, Tom decided to speak again, gently testing the young man's willingness to share. "You've been running for a while, haven't you?" he asked softly. If you want to tell me your story, I'll listen. If not, that's fine too. The man looked at Tom, his eyes thoughtful. After a long pause, he began to speak in broken English, explaining that he had been on the run to escape capture. He did not go into details, but Tom understood enough. The young man was a fugitive, a survivor of circumstances he had not chosen, and someone who had relied on his own strength and wit to stay alive. Tom felt a mixture of empathy and admiration. This was a person who had faced extreme adversity and had survived. The afternoon passed, and soon the sun began to dip toward the horizon again. Tom and the young man prepared dinner together, a simple meal of beans and bread. They ate in relative silence, each lost in thought. Yet the silence was comfortable, not awkward. Tom realized that he had never shared such a quiet meal with a stranger before, and yet it felt natural. As night fell, Tom made sure the cabin was secure. He lit a fire in the hearth and checked the locks on the doors. The young man watched him quietly, then nodded, a small smile breaking across his face. It was the first sign of relaxation Tom had seen since the man's arrival. He understood that trust was building, slowly but surely. Before bed, the young man spoke once more, repeating the words from the night before with a calm but serious tone. "You gave me your bed, rancher. Get ready for what comes next." Tom looked at him, now seeing not a threat, but a promise. The man would honor the trust he had been given, and in return, Tom would face whatever challenges lay ahead with him. That night, Tom lay on the floor again, listening to the wind outside and the quiet breathing of the young man on the bed. The air was still, but the sense of anticipation lingered. Tom understood that his life had changed. The quiet routine of ranch life was gone, replaced by uncertainty, responsibility, and the possibility of adventure. He closed his eyes, preparing himself for whatever would come next, knowing that the bond between him and the fugitive had already begun to shape their shared future. The next morning, the desert seemed brighter, almost too bright, with the sun rising early over the wide open plains. Tom McAllister had been awake before dawn again, tending to his morning chores as usual. But today his mind was more alert than ever. The words from the Apache fugitive echoed in his thoughts, "Get ready for what comes next." Tom didn't know what to expect, but he felt a strange mixture of anticipation and unease. The desert was never truly quiet. It always held dangers hidden beneath its beauty, and Tom had learned to respect it. After finishing his chores, Tom went inside the cabin to check on his guest. The young man was already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed and quietly observing the horizon. There was a calm strength in him that seemed almost unnatural for someone who had been traveling for days and was constantly on guard. Tom realized again that this man was no ordinary visitor. He carried with him experience, skill, and knowledge that Tom could only guess at. "Morning," Tom said softly. "Did you sleep well?" The man nodded, his eyes meeting Tom's briefly before looking away. There was still a guardedness in his gaze, but also a hint of something else, trust. Trust had been earned slowly, and Tom felt the weight of that responsibility. He poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to the young man, who accepted it carefully, holding it as if it were more than just a drink. It was a symbol of safety and routine. After breakfast, Tom suggested they check the perimeter of the ranch together. The young man followed without hesitation, moving with a quiet awareness that made Tom feel both reassured and cautious. They walked along the fence line, inspecting the posts and the cattle. The young man's eyes scanned every detail, the tracks in the dirt, the shape of the clouds, the position of the sun. He noticed small things that Tom, familiar with the land, sometimes overlooked. "You have a good eye," Tom said, impressed.
"I didn't see that weak spot over there." The young man gave a small nod, acknowledging the compliment without words. Tom felt a growing respect for him.
This was not just a survivor. This was someone who could handle unexpected challenges and think ahead in ways Tom had not considered. As the morning wore on, the ranch felt unusually quiet. The wind had died down, leaving only the faint rustle of dry grass. Tom suddenly noticed a group of figures on horseback in the distance, approaching the property. He squinted against the sun, trying to make out who they were. They were not familiar faces. Their movements were purposeful, and Tom immediately felt a sense of tension. He motioned to the young man, pointing toward the approaching riders. The man's expression hardened slightly, and he moved closer to Tom, scanning the horizon with sharp, calculating eyes. Tom realized that whatever was coming next might test the trust they had built, their skills, and their ability to act quickly. The riders reached the edge of the property and slowed, clearly observing the ranch. Tom could feel his heart rate quicken. He had always been cautious of strangers, but now there was someone at his gate who might bring trouble. He looked at the young man, unsure if he should trust him in a confrontation. The man's gaze met his, steady and unwavering, and Tom sensed a silent communication. "I know what to do." Without speaking, the young man moved toward the cabin to retrieve a small satchel he had brought with him. He checked its contents carefully, then returned to Tom's side. Tom could see the determination in his eyes. This was a man ready to defend the trust and hospitality that had been offered to him. As the riders came closer, Tom stepped forward and called out, "Who's there?" "What do you want?" The leader of the group responded with a voice that was harsh but not threatening. "We're just passing through, checking the area." No trouble intended. Tom studied them carefully. Something about the way they spoke and moved did not sit right with him. He noticed a glint of metal at one rider's side, possibly a weapon. The young man standing beside him did not move, but Tom could feel the tension radiating from him. It was clear he was prepared for any sudden action. Tom decided to remain calm. "You're on my property," he said firmly. "Make sure you respect that, and there won't be a problem." The riders hesitated, then slowly moved along the edge of the property, not stopping but watching closely as they passed. Tom exhaled in relief, though he knew the threat was not completely gone. The desert was unpredictable, and people often tested boundaries in ways that could become dangerous. He looked at the young man and nodded. "Thanks," he said quietly. "You handled that well." The man merely nodded in return, his face calm but focused. There was a sense of pride in his posture, but it was subtle, almost hidden. Tom realized that this young man had been in situations far more dangerous than anything he had ever faced on his quiet ranch. And yet, he remained composed, alert, and ready to act when necessary. After the riders disappeared into the distance, Tom and the young man continued their work around the ranch, checking fences and inspecting the livestock. The afternoon heat pressed down, and the air was still and heavy. Tom noticed how the young man moved with both strength and care, making sure every task was done correctly, yet always keeping an eye on the surroundings. It was clear that he had learned to survive by being both strong and aware. As the day wore on, Tom began to ask more questions, carefully and without pressing too hard. "How did you survive out there?" he asked, gesturing to the wide plains surrounding the ranch. The man hesitated, then spoke slowly. He told a few stories of travel across the desert, of avoiding capture, of finding food and water in the harsh terrain. He did not speak of every hardship, but enough to let Tom understand the skill and resilience required to survive alone. Tom listened intently, realizing that this man had lived a life of constant challenge, and yet he remained unbroken. By late afternoon, clouds had gathered on the horizon, hinting at a storm. Tom and the young man worked quickly to secure the livestock in the pens and double-check the fences. The wind began to pick up, carrying dust across the land. There was a sense of urgency in the air, not just from the approaching storm, but from the knowledge that they were no longer alone in the desert. They had already faced potential danger from the riders, and the storm reminded Tom that the environment itself could be as threatening as any person. As they finished their tasks, Tom finally spoke the words that had been on his mind since the morning. "I don't know what you meant by 'get ready for what comes next,'" he said cautiously, "but I think I understand now. You're not warning me, you're preparing me." The young man looked at him and nodded. There was a faint smile on his lips, though his eyes remained serious. Tom realized that the bond between them was strengthening with each shared challenge, each moment of trust and cooperation. This was not just about survival. It was about understanding, respect, and the unspoken code between two people thrown together by circumstance. As the first drops of rain began to fall, the two men returned to the cabin. The storm outside grew heavier, with wind whipping through the open plains and rain tapping against the roof. Inside, the fire in the hearth burned brightly, providing warmth and light against the growing darkness. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the storm, feeling the comfort of shelter and companionship. Tom realized that the day had tested both of them in ways he had not anticipated. The riders, the environment, and the unknown had all forced him to trust the young man completely. And in return, the young man had acted with skill, caution, and loyalty. The words from the night before had been a promise, and today, that promise had been fulfilled in action. As the storm raged outside, Tom felt a deep sense of connection. This was no longer just a rancher offering shelter to a fugitive. They were partners in facing the challenges of the desert, each relying on the other's strengths. The day had shown Tom that courage, trust, and careful action were not abstract ideas. They were essential tools for survival and for building bonds that could withstand even the harshest conditions. By nightfall, the storm had passed, leaving the desert glistening under the moonlight. Tom and the young man prepared for bed, the events of the day still fresh in their minds. The cabin felt safer, stronger, and more alive than it ever had before. And as they settled in for the night, Tom finally understood the meaning of those mysterious words. Get ready for what comes next was not a threat, it was an invitation to trust, to act wisely, and to face the challenges ahead together. The next morning dawned bright and clear, with a cool breeze brushing across Tom McAllister's ranch. The previous day's storm had washed the desert clean, leaving the earth smelling fresh and strong. Sunlight reflected off the distant hills, and the cattle moved quietly, grazing without fear. Tom felt a sense of calm, though it was a calm built on awareness. The events of the past days had reminded him that life on the frontier was unpredictable, and that danger could appear when least expected. Tom stepped outside, stretching his arms, feeling the warmth of the sun on his shoulders. The Apache fugitive was already awake, standing near the fence line and scanning the horizon with steady, sharp eyes. Tom admired the man's vigilance. It was clear that his guest had instincts honed by years of survival in harsh conditions, and Tom felt both reassured and challenged by that presence. After a simple breakfast, Tom and the young man went about their morning chores. The fences needed checking again after the storm, and the water troughs had to be refilled. As they worked, Tom noticed how the man's movements were precise and efficient. Every nail hammered, every plank repaired, every bucket of water carried with care showed experience and discipline. It struck Tom that this young man had survived not by luck alone but by careful attention, quick thinking, and courage. As they neared the far edge of the property, a sudden commotion caught their attention. A small group of men appeared near the herd of cattle, riding quickly and shouting. Tom's heart sank. He had feared trouble from strangers, but now it had arrived. The men were rustlers, intent on taking some of his livestock. Tom could see their intentions clearly. They had no respect for boundaries, and they underestimated the rancher, who had spent years protecting this land. Tom instinctively reached for his rifle, but before he could act, the young man stepped forward calmly. He did not draw a weapon immediately. Instead, he assessed the situation with a keen, calculating gaze. Tom realized that the man had already analyzed the terrain, the positions of the rustlers and the vulnerabilities of both the herd and the ranch. Without a word, he nodded toward Tom, signaling him to follow his lead. The two of them moved strategically, using the terrain to their advantage. The young man pointed out a narrow path along the fence line where they could position themselves to surprise the intruders. Tom followed, trusting the instincts and judgment of the man he had taken in. Together, they created a plan in silence, a plan built on observation, patience, and understanding of both human nature and the land. As the rustlers approached the herd, the young man made his move. He stepped into view, shouting loudly to startle the intruders. His voice carried across the open field, firm and commanding, and it immediately drew attention. The rustlers hesitated, surprised by the sudden confrontation. Then, with swift precision, the young man moved closer, signaling Tom to follow. Together, they forced the men to halt, cutting off their escape routes and using the fence and uneven terrain as a barrier. The rustlers were caught off guard. They had expected an easy target, but they had not counted on the careful planning and quick thinking of the Apache fugitive and the rancher. One of the intruders reached for a weapon, but the young man acted first, stepping quickly to disarm him without causing serious harm. Tom moved to block another, using his strength and height to intimidate without escalating the conflict. Within moments, the situation had shifted completely. Tom watched in awe as the young man continued to take control of the encounter. His movements were precise and confident, yet measured. He did not act recklessly, and he did not cause unnecessary harm. Instead, he used his knowledge, his instincts, and his presence to protect the ranch, the cattle, and Tom himself. It was clear that the trust Tom had placed in him was being returned in full measure. After a tense few minutes, the rustlers, realizing they had underestimated their opponents, retreated. They fled across the desert, shouting threats that were empty against the calm strength and preparation of the two men. Tom and the young man watched them go, breathing heavily but unharmed. The herd of cattle had remained largely safe, and the ranch had been defended without serious injury. Tom felt a mix of relief, pride, and respect for the young man who had proven himself so quickly and effectively. Once the rustlers were gone, Tom turned to the young man. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "You handled that perfectly. I couldn't have done it without you." The man simply nodded, his eyes serious but calm. There was no prideful boast, only quiet acknowledgement. Tom realized that this was a person who had lived through challenges far greater than he could imagine, and yet had maintained humility, focus, and integrity. He had not acted out of anger or aggression, but out of necessity, respect, and honor. As the afternoon passed, the two men worked together to secure the ranch further. They repaired broken gates, reinforced weak spots in the fences, and even moved some of the more vulnerable cattle closer to the cabin. Throughout it all, the young man remained calm, alert, and efficient. Tom began to understand the depth of his guest's abilities, and he knew that the trust he had extended was being returned in the most tangible way possible. Action. By late afternoon, the sun began to lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the ranch. Tom and the young man returned to the cabin, exhausted but satisfied. The events of the day had tested them both, and they had emerged stronger and more connected. There was an unspoken bond now, built on shared experience, mutual respect, and the understanding that both men had faced danger together and survived. As they prepared a simple dinner of beans, bread, and roasted vegetables, Tom reflected on the journey so far. He had offered help without expecting anything in return, and yet he had been repaid in ways he could never have imagined. The young man had not only protected the ranch, but he had also taught Tom lessons about vigilance, strategy, and the strength of quiet determination. During the meal, the young man finally spoke more openly. He told stories of past challenges he had faced while traveling alone, of times when he had had to rely on his own skill and quick thinking to survive. Tom listened intently, fascinated by the tales of resilience, courage, and resourcefulness. The man spoke of loyalty to those who had shown him kindness, of the importance of careful observation, and of acting decisively when the moment required it. Each story reinforced the lessons Tom had already witnessed firsthand. After dinner, they cleaned up together, maintaining the rhythm of shared responsibility. The young man moved with quiet precision, handling the smallest tasks with the same care he had shown in defending the ranch. Tom realized that this was more than just survival skill. It was a mindset, a way of living that demanded attention, respect, and honor. As night fell, the two men settled in by the fire. The wind had returned, rustling the dry grass outside, but inside the cabin there was warmth, safety, and a sense of shared purpose. Tom felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had taken a risk by offering shelter, but that risk had been rewarded in ways that went beyond mere survival. The young man had shown courage, skill, and loyalty, demonstrating that trust and kindness could create bonds stronger than fear or suspicion. Before going to bed, the young man spoke softly, repeating the words from earlier, in a calm, measured voice. "You gave me your bed, rancher, and I will always honor that trust." Tom looked at him, understanding now the true meaning of the promise. It was not just about action, it was about loyalty, respect, and the unspoken code that guided the Apache fugitive's life. That night, as Tom lay on the floor of the cabin, he reflected on the day's events. The danger had been real,
The test had been significant, and the lessons had been profound.
He realized that the young man had not only protected him, but had also helped him grow, teaching him about courage, careful planning, and the value of trusting someone who had proven themselves. The bond between them had deepened, and Tom knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The desert outside was quiet once more, illuminated by the moon and stars. The wind whispered through the plains, carrying the promise of new challenges and new lessons. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low, casting warm light on two figures connected by trust, experience, and shared purpose. Tom finally understood that the true value of kindness was not in expecting repayment, but in the strength and loyalty it could inspire in return. And as he drifted into sleep, he felt a sense of readiness. The young man had prepared him well, not just for the dangers of the world, but for the unexpected moments when courage, skill, and trust were the only tools that could protect them both. The turning point had come, and both men had proven themselves. Tomorrow, the story would continue, and whatever came next, they would face it together. The next morning, the ranch was quiet, bathed in soft golden light as the sun slowly rose over the horizon. Tom McAllister moved through his morning chores with the rhythm he had always known, but this time, he felt a new sense of purpose. The events of the past few days had changed everything. The storm, the rustlers, and the unexpected arrival of the Apache fugitive had tested him in ways he could never have imagined. More than that, it had taught him lessons about trust, courage, and the unexpected ways kindness could return to him. The young man was already awake, standing near the edge of the porch, scanning the surrounding land with the same careful eyes that had become familiar to Tom. The desert stretched out endlessly before them, a vast landscape full of possibilities, dangers, and secrets. Tom realized that the young man had not just survived this land, he had mastered it. His presence brought both comfort and a reminder of how careful one had to be in the wilderness. "Morning," Tom said, greeting him softly. The young man nodded in return, acknowledging the day and the work it would bring. There was a quiet understanding between them now, a bond that did not require many words. They had faced danger together, relied on each other, and emerged stronger for it. After breakfast, they moved to inspect the ranch once more. Tom had noticed that several areas of the fence needed reinforcement after the storm and the earlier disturbance with the rustlers.
As they worked, he observed how the young man moved with confidence, carefully checking every post, every latch, every weak spot.
Tom realized that the man's attention to detail and skill were unmatched. It was clear that he had survived not by luck, but by preparation, intelligence, and the ability to remain calm under pressure. By mid-morning, the quiet of the ranch was broken by a distant sound, the clatter of hooves and raised voices. Tom's heart sank, fearing another group of intruders. The young man, however, remained calm, scanning the horizon and analyzing the distance, the direction, and the speed of the approaching riders. He gestured to Tom to stay low and move carefully. Once again, the Apache fugitive had assessed the situation and was preparing a plan. As the riders drew closer, it became clear that they were not rustlers this time, but messengers from a nearby town. They had heard about the previous day's incident and had come to apologize and report that the rustlers were being pursued by local authorities. Tom exhaled with relief. It was a reminder that the world beyond his ranch was full of unpredictability, and that even seemingly small actions could have wider consequences. The young man's eyes softened slightly, the tension easing from his posture. He had once again demonstrated that vigilance and preparation were as important as courage. Tom felt a profound sense of respect for him, realizing that the bond they had formed was built on shared experience, trust, and mutual reliance. After the messengers left, Tom and the young man returned to their chores. They worked together in silence for most of the afternoon, repairing fences, moving cattle, and preparing the ranch for the evening. The young man's quiet efficiency impressed Tom at every turn. He seemed to anticipate problems before they arose and acted with careful precision. Tom realized that this man had lived a life where mistakes could be dangerous, and that his skills were honed not for show, but for survival. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange, pink, and purple, Tom suggested they take a short break. They sat on the porch, watching the desert stretch out before them. The silence was comfortable, filled with understanding rather than emptiness. Tom looked at the young man and felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had offered a bed, a meal and safety, and had received loyalty, courage, and wisdom in return.
"You've taught me a lot these past few days," Tom said quietly.
More than I thought I would learn in a lifetime. The young man nodded, a small smile forming on his lips. "I only repay what is given," he said softly. Tom understood the meaning immediately. The man's life had been shaped by the principle of honoring trust, and he had done so in every action since arriving at the ranch. As evening settled in, they moved back into the cabin to prepare dinner. Tom cooked while the young man set the table and fetched water. Their movements were synchronized, a silent dance of cooperation and understanding. Tom reflected on the unusual path that had led to this moment. A chance encounter, an act of kindness, and a series of challenges that had tested both men. What had begun as a simple offer of shelter had grown into a partnership rooted in trust, respect, and shared experience. After dinner, they cleaned up together, the fire crackling in the hearth and casting a warm glow around the cabin. The young man spoke again, sharing stories from his past, not of hardships or escapes, but of lessons learned, how to survive, how to trust, and how to act with honor even when the world was unfair. Tom listened intently, realizing that this man had lived a life of extreme challenge and had emerged with principles that were rare and admirable. As night fell and the desert grew quiet once more, Tom felt a profound sense of peace. The wind whispered through the plains, and the stars shone brightly overhead. He realized that the young man had become more than just a guest. He was a friend, a partner, and a teacher. Together they had faced danger, acted with courage, and built a bond that would last far longer than the events of a few days. Before bed, the young man spoke one last time, repeating the words that had first struck Tom when he arrived. "You gave me your bed, rancher, and I will honor that trust." Tom understood fully now. The words were not only about the actions of the past days, but also about a principle that would guide their relationship in the future. Trust and loyalty were not earned through words alone, but through consistent action and shared experience. That night, Tom lay on the floor as usual, but sleep came more easily than it had before. The events of the past days had tested him in ways he could not have imagined, and he had emerged stronger, wiser, and more connected to another human being. He reflected on the lessons he had learned. Courage is not the absence of fear. Trust is earned through action, and kindness can create bonds stronger than any challenge the world may throw at you. The desert outside was calm, bathed in the soft glow of the moonlight. The wind rustled gently through the grass, carrying with it a sense of possibility and promise. Tom understood that life on the ranch would continue, full of its usual routines and occasional dangers, but he no longer faced it alone. The young man had become a part of his life, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, trust, courage, and loyalty could create moments of profound connection. As the night deepened, Tom drifted into a peaceful sleep, confident that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The bond forged through shared experience, trust, and courage had become unbreakable. The desert was wide and unpredictable, but inside the small cabin, two men who had started as strangers now shared a sense of purpose, honor, and understanding that would guide them for the rest of their days. The Apache fugitive had arrived at Tom's ranch as a weary traveler in need of shelter, but he left an enduring lesson. True trust is shown through action, kindness is repaid in loyalty, and courage is strengthened when shared with those who honor it. Tom McAllister would never forget the experience, the man, or the bond that had formed. It had changed him, his life, and his perspective forever. And in the quiet of the desert night under the stars, both men understood that their story was only beginning. A story built on respect, trust, and the unspoken promises that had been honored in every action.